Part 2. The Child. A youth to whom was given so much of earth, so much of heaven. Wordsworth. There is always one moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in. Graham Greene. 6. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. James chapter 4 verse 7. Unseen forces first intruded into Ted's life when he was very young, no more than 4 or 5, and the events of that intrusion resulted in a scolding and a spanking. This, and the high strangeness of the whole affair, made it something he never forgot. Shortly after dawn one morning, young Teddy awoke to find himself floating out of the bed. He was surprised but unafraid, even though, as his point of view ascended, he glanced down and saw his body still asleep with his head sticking out of the covers. The next thing he knew, Teddy was in the kitchen, apparently hovering near the ceiling, as a busy scene unfolded below him in the room. His mother and grandmother were there, talking with his aunt, uncle, and young cousin Sally, who had stopped by unexpectedly. Teddy was so amazed by the situation that all he could do was watch and listen. "What are y'all doing out here so early?" his mother asked. "You must be on your way somewhere." "Yes," his aunt said, "we decided last night to ride over to Parish today, to see my brother and his family before they leave to go back to Mobile. They've been up there with Daddy for a few days. So we thought we'd stop and pick up Teddy, if you'll let him come. Sally and him, they always have a good time together. They keep each other occupied and out of our hair," she laughed. Up above them, Teddy grew excited, eager to go off with his cousin. Sally was one of his favorite playmates, and any adventure that broke the pleasant monotony of farm life was a treat. "No," his mother said, and Teddy couldn't believe his ears. "No, he better not go this time. His daddy is coming in today, and we're supposed to take Teddy to get a haircut and some new shoes. He's got holes in those things he's wearing. So I think we better pass this time." Teddy was heartbroken and angry. "What do you mean?" he shouted. "Why can't I go?" But no matter how loudly he protested, his mother and everyone else in the room ignored him. Finally he realized that they didn't even know he was there. They couldn't see him or hear him, and his young mind was bewildered. No matter how hard he tried to interrupt them, they kept talking about the relatives and other trivial matters, and then his uncle's family prepared to leave. "How about y'all going out the back door, around that side of the house?" his mother suggested. "If Teddy hears you leave out the front door, he'll surely wake up. He'll throw a fit to go with you, and I'll end up having to spank his bottom to make him stop showing out." They all laughed, and she followed the others out the back door, leaving Teddy sputtering indignantly and invisibly. He was angry that he couldn't go, angry that they'd laughed about him getting a spanking, and most of all angry at being ignored. Suddenly, Teddy popped up from his bed and looked around in puzzlement. Apparently he was back in his body, but he didn't pause to think about it. Still bristling with indignation, he jumped out of bed and stormed down the long hallway into the kitchen. His mother and grandmother were there alone, cleaning the breakfast table. "Why didn't you let me go?" he shouted angrily. "I wanted to go with Sally. I wanted to go on the trip." The two women stared at him and then at each other. "What on earth are you talking about?" his mother asked. "They was just here. I saw 'em," Teddy said, still shouting, as he wiped away tears of frustration. "No, you didn't," she argued. "That was over an hour ago, and I checked your room right after they left. You were asleep." "Ha, I was in here," he insisted. "You were mean. You wouldn't answer me when I talked to you, Mama. I saw my uncle and aunt and Sally right here. They said could I go with them, and you said no." "But I wanted to go, I want to go. Right now." Teddy's mother picked him up and gave him a couple of swats on the backside. "You stop that temper fit right now," she commanded and sent him back to his room. He calmed down for the moment, but later when he repeated his story about being in the kitchen and seeing the relatives, he was angry and bewildered when no one believed him. And when she managed to get him alone for a moment, his grandmother cautioned him to stop talking about such things. "They're going to think you're mighty strange and peculiar, Teddy," she said. Things like that just don't happen. And if they did, they'd be bad things. You're too young to know about King Saul and the Witch of Endor, but it's right there in the Bible. You've got to stay away from such dark things, child. She hugged him tightly. Grandy loves you, Teddy, she whispered. You're my good little boy, my little dear one, and I'll always take care of you. But you've got to watch out, all your life. There's a lot of good in this world. And there's a whole lot of bad, too. He let his grandmother comfort him. He hadn't understood why she was so concerned, any more than he had understood what had happened to him. But if Grandy said it was wrong, then it must be so, he thought. And when no one mentioned it again, the incident was soon forgotten. Years later, in 1975, it all came back to him, though. Ted was living in Atlanta then, actively involved with the Kingsgate Spiritualist Church. He was a full-time bank employee, but he devoted several evenings a week to the study and practice of his psychic work. He did private readings and occasional public presentations, fascinating the audience as he picked out person after person to scan and discuss. He saw scenes of their past and visions of their future that later quite often proved to be correct. It was during this time that a couple of very odd incidents occurred. One night, Ted woke up, and, moving as if in a dream, he went to the typewriter, inserted blank paper, and began to click at the keys. A story was clear and full in his mind, a story of a little boy, Carly Kane, a voice told Ted, chasing a rabbit in a field. It began with Carly walking home for lunch, with a small rabbit in his arms, when he was overcome by fatigue and went into the shade of a tree. His awareness changed suddenly, expanding, and then he found himself in a different place, slipping into unconsciousness. When he awoke, he heard beautiful music. A voice from an unseen source guided him through a misty wonderland of wild creatures, and nearby a group of small children sang. The music made Carly think of heaven. There were about 30 children dressed in blue, and he reached out to touch one of them. No, the voice said, you cannot be with them at this time. Carly grew angry, screaming and kicking against the voice and the force that restrained him. And suddenly everything changed. The children were gone, the shade tree was gone, even his rabbit was gone, and Carly was alone in the sun, longing for home. Ted finished the story and went right back to bed. It was only the next morning, when found the neatly typed pages on his desk, that he recalled getting up sometime during the night and writing it, although he had no idea what had motivated him or how he had managed to do it at that hour. The second time this happened, Ted had even less memory of the event. He woke one morning and found another neatly typed piece of writing, several pages in length, lying beside his typewriter. He lived alone, so there was no one else who could have typed them, but the words he read were completely unfamiliar. He had a vague, hazy memory of getting up during the night, but he couldn't remember doing anything else, especially typing. Still, he must have been the author, and that made the story on the pages all the more puzzling. It was about Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, but Ted had no great interest in Margaret Mitchell. The story told of Miss Mitchell's creation of her masterpiece, a task which had been accomplished with the aid of some spirit form or guide. Working through Miss Mitchell, this spirit entity had shaped a grand book that brought the romantic Southern tradition to life. As the story in his hands explained, the spirit was a highly evolved soul that had once lived a life similar to Scarlett O'Hara's, and her tale was as strong as the ancient mariners, and she had to tell it. She needed a release for this energy, and Margaret was her channel. Through Margaret's pen, she would be able to confess her unjust deeds that had hurt so many when she was on the earth plane. It would help Margaret in her own spiritual development as well, and entertainment would be brought to countless millions. Quietly and secretively she moved in around Margaret, and they formed a team that produced one of the greatest novels of all times. This was not the sort of message, or the medium, he was familiar with from his spirit guides. The meaning in the story wasn't clear to him, but he was even more concerned that he had no memory at all of writing it. At least the first story, he realized, might have a partial explanation. for it was clear that Carly's own description, actions, and background were copied from his own. He wondered if the story came from some unforgotten childhood memory, so Ted searched through his past but came up empty. He simply didn't remember such a thing happening to him at 8 years old, which was Carly's age in the story. Thinking back to those years in Alabama did bring to mind the memory of that morning he left his body in bed and floated into the kitchen, though. He loved his childhood and the people who cared for him, especially his Grandy. Wistfully he thought about her, and an old, haunting emotion started up in him. Her death, when he was 10 years old, had cut deeply into his heart. Although there was no reason for it, Ted had always suffered a sense of guilt and uncertainty about it. If only things hadn't been so strange just before she died, perhaps he would have felt differently. His family had moved away from the farm by then and into a small town, so he didn't get to visit Grandy very often. Sometimes she would come for a visit and stay 2 or 3 weeks, filling the house with the delicious smells of cobblers, cookies, and cakes. Their house was small, and when Grandy visited, she shared his little bedroom, snuggling up warmly at night and lulling him to sleep with stories of the old times. Every detail of her last visit was still clear in Ted's mind. Daddy had brought her to town on Thursday night, because it was such a long drive to the farm and back. They hardly had a chance to talk before bed, but Teddy looked forward to the weekend and some of Grandy's wonderful hot biscuits for Sunday breakfast. He put on his pajamas and climbed in between the blankets, and then his grandmother, in a long white gown, slid in beside him. The bed soon filled with her warmth, and Teddy dozed off almost immediately. It was dark when he opened his eyes. He sensed something in the room, long before he heard it, but when he tried to sit up and look around, his body wouldn't move. He felt wild-eyed terror, like a trapped animal, wishing with all his heart that he could burrow to safety under Grandy beside him. Something shifted then, and Teddy was suddenly aware of being at the foot of the bed. He saw both their bodies still under the covers, and now he could hear a voice. It was unfamiliar, deep and angry and male, and for a crazy moment he wondered if the voice could possibly be coming from him, since he didn't see anyone else in the room. The words made no sense, however, but Teddy could feel the dangerous anger within them. A shift again, and he was back in his body, in bed and still unable to move. Grandy wasn't moving, either. The man's deep, frightening voice droned on, and Teddy fought to cry out at him to stop. His mouth wouldn't work. He couldn't raise his hand to turn on the bedside lamp. He couldn't punch his grandmother in the back and wake her up. He couldn't do anything but feel afraid. So he closed his eyes, and the next moment, it seemed, he opened them to see daylight streaming in through the lace-curtained window by the bed. Grandy was already up and gone. Sleepily, Teddy went into the kitchen and found her sitting at the table alone. She was dressed in the same clothes she'd worn the day before, and her suitcase stood waiting by the back door. "Where's Mama?" he asked, looking around. "In the bathroom," she answered. "And your daddy's gone off to work. Think you ought to get ready for school now?" He said, turning to go. But then he stopped and walked back over to his grandmother with a puzzled look on his face. "What was that last night?" he asked. "What was what?" she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Didn't you hear it, Grandy?" he asked. "Who was that man? I woke up and heard him talking. I didn't see him, but he scared me." "Who was that?" She reached out and enfolded Teddy into her lap. There were tears in her eyes when she finally answered him, and the young boy began to cry, too. "That was the devil, child," she told him. "That was the devil, but don't you worry about it none. Your grandma took care of him, so don't think about it anymore." She kissed him on both cheeks and then put him back down on the floor. "Now, go get dressed, and I'm going to fix you a good breakfast." "Go on, now," she commanded. Teddy obeyed, but he was troubled by Grandy's statement. And her tears. If she was frightened enough to cry, he thought, the devil must surely be a bad, bad man. He was glad that Grandy had promised to protect him. When he returned from school that day, he found his mother and father and grandmother in the middle of a heated argument. "That's crazy," his father was saying. "You just got here, for heaven's sake." He turned to Teddy's mother for support, but she just shrugged. "No matter," Grandy replied. "I want to go home, right now." "I can't just load up and drive you all the way back to the farm, Mama," his father said. "I got things to take care of. Why don't you wait till next weekend?" Grandy's expression never wavered. "I'm packed, and I want to leave now. I'm sorry to get in your way, but you've got to take me home." Teddy's father shook his head. "I just can't do it, not tonight," he said. "The best I can do is tomorrow, but this is just crazy." "Tomorrow, then," Grandy reluctantly agreed. "You drive me home in the morning." That night in Teddy's bed, she read her Bible out loud to him for a long time. And then she prayed in earnest, rocking the boy back and forth in her arms to the rhythm of the whispered words. Before breakfast the next day, she was dressed and packed again, waiting impatiently for the family to get ready. When everything was packed and loaded, they set off on the 3-hour drive to the old farm. Teddy played happily in the back seat, but had he noticed that in the front the grown-ups were hardly talking? His father looked perplexed, his mother bewildered, and his grandmother simply stared straight ahead without a word to anyone. When they reached the farm, Teddy tumbled out of the car and ran into the yard, eager to stretch and play after the morning's long drive. His parents helped Grandy take her things inside, and Teddy raced around to the backyard for the tire swing that dangled from a large tree by the fence. The stress of the long trip soon vanished, and he felt exhilarated to be back in the place he loved best. A sudden scream echoed out from the house, and Teddy stopped swinging. There was another scream as he raced indoors, but before he could go very far his mother grabbed him up and hurried him out of the living room. Over her shoulder, he could see his father kneeling on the floor and his beloved Grandy lying there white and still. Everything went into slow motion. In a daze, he watched as his grandmother slipped away, waiting for an ambulance to arrive. Whatever happened after that was a blurry memory. It was a long time before Teddy stopped grieving for his grandmother, and he never forgot those strange words she had whispered at the breakfast table. It was the devil. He couldn't explain the guilt he felt about her death, either. The doctors said Grandy had died from a massive stroke, but Teddy wasn't sure. He'd heard that evil voice, and if Grandy said it was the devil, then it surely was. So what did the devil want, then? Grandy told him not to worry, that she and God would protect him, but from what? Was that why his grandmother died, to protect him? Nothing he learned later in his spiritualist training was able to explain that event, so it remained a distant memory kept tender by his haunting, faceless guilt. 7. 4 angels to my bed, 2 angels round my head, 1 to watch, and 1 to pray, and 2 to bear my soul away. Thomas 80. For several years after Grandy's death, Ted lived a generally normal, happy life, adapted to his time and place. Small-town Alabama in the 1950s was a narrow world in many ways. Its people professed conservative religious and political beliefs, even if they didn't always practice them, and their expectations in life were modest and provincial. Things seldom changed, and that suited everyone just fine, including Ted. After all, he was popular in school, with plenty of friends, and very involved in extracurricular activities. His high school years should have sailed along smoothly and predictably. But Ted wasn't destined for the life of a typical teenager. Someone or something else, whether divine or demented, Ted debated years later, had other plans. In the middle of his 14th year, the agents of this unknown force decided to pay him a visit. They came in the night, like thieves, and stole away Ted's tranquility. He thought they were angels. When he awoke in bed that night, the first thing Ted saw was a soft glow of bluish-green light pervading the room. Then he watched in pure disbelief as 2 small beings simply appeared through the wall and stood facing him. They looked like immature human forms dressed in flowing robes of blue and green, and their heads were covered by hoods or turbans. Ted tried to see their faces clearly, but it was as if they had no facial features, almost as if were translucent. He was transfixed, unable to move, until the two beings came to either side of the bed. Then he found himself floating between them as they maneuvered him right through the wall and out into the dark night. Gliding above the ground, they continued down the street and stopped at the deserted schoolyard half a block away. By this time, Ted was able to look around a bit, and off in the distance he saw two more angels moving toward him, with a young girl between them. It was his neighbor and schoolmate, Jill, and she looked as frozen and bewildered as he did. The angels positioned the two young people face to face, and one angel stepped between them. It placed its hand over Ted's chest for a moment and then moved it to the space over Jill's heart. A strange voice sounded in Ted's head, "We have merged your souls." Ted didn't understand what this meant, as if his mind was unable to function, so he just nodded mutely. Suddenly, a brilliant light flared up around them on every side, blinding him. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in his bed, shivering. And for the rest of the night he lay awake thinking about the strange event and the hooded angels. Nothing about the experience made any sense. Not, that is, until the next day. At school, the moment Ted saw Jill he felt a rush of emotion as strong as a physical jolt. Yesterday he wouldn't have given her a second thought, but today he adored her. Totally, completely. And painfully. The scene with the angels came back to him, and he knew that somehow he and Jill had been marked for each other, destined to be together. Their love was designed and created by a heavenly source, he realized, and surely Jill must know it, too. But she walked on past him without a word. And although Ted immediately thereafter put all his energy into pursuing her, Jill just didn't seem to care about his burning love. Ted was crushed. He lost interest in outside activities, ignored his schoolwork, and withdrew from his friends. Yet driven, all through junior high and high school, Ted tried his best to draw Jill to him. He carried her books after class, sat beside her in study hall, dogged her from a wistful distance, but all she ever gave him in return was casual friendship. Through those adolescent years, Ted ached for her. He watched her with other boys, flirting and dating as all the other girls did, and still he loved her. Once in desperation, Ted tried to get Jill to talk about that night in the schoolyard. "Don't you remember?" he asked. "How the angels put our souls together. For heaven's sake, Jill, how could you ever forget it?" "Stop it," she said, "don't talk about such crazy things. That's too weird." "But what was it all about?" he pressed. "What did the angels do to us? I can't believe you don't feel the same way they made me feel about you. They merged our souls." His look pleaded with her for some sign of understanding, but all he felt back was her growing discomfort and anger, even a hint of fear. "I mean it, Teddy," she warned, "you better quit talking about that. I don't want to hear it. Just leave me alone." Bewildered by her denial, Ted backed away at last. Mere friendship wasn't what he wanted, so he withdrew. But in their senior year, when Jill broke up with her boyfriend, she sought Ted out again, and this time he relented. They even dated sporadically, but without the least hint of romance. Once he resigned himself to being only friends. A different kind of closeness steadily grew. He took no chances, never again mentioned the night with the angels, and tried to feel satisfied that Jill now trusted and relied on him as her confidant. From time to time he thought about the merging of their souls, wondering why the magic of the angels hadn't worked with Jill. His high school years passed in this way, and no one was aware of Ted's loneliness. Outwardly, Ted was jovial and content, no different from the other students. But his nights, his dreams, set him apart. One recurrent dream always seemed compelling, even portentous. The first time it came to him was shortly after the angels took him to the schoolyard, and it recurred 3 or 4 times a year after that. The dream always seemed the same. Ted found himself floating up gently from his bed and through the ceiling. Traveling at a great speed, he passed through lights, momentary streaks of brilliant color, and then he was looking down on a sagebrush desert area, with snowy mountains in the distance. Below, an old Greyhound-type bus, inexplicably painted yellow, moved along a small road. Ted felt himself drop through the roof of the bus into a seat about halfway back from the driver. Several other people were on the bus, too, but they ignored him. The bus drove north toward the mountains for a while, and then it suddenly hesitated and came to a stop on the pavement, as if waiting for something. Curious, Ted walked up to the front and peered through the windshield. Ahead he could see cowboys on horseback, herding hundreds of sheep across the road. He walked back to his seat, and as the heat inside the bus had increased, he opened the window. A small chuckwagon rolled by, and Ted heard a strange language spoken by its passengers. Finally, the last of the sheep cleared the road, and once again the bus started north. The land was beautiful. Ted saw a crystal-clear creek not far from the road, where a few men were fishing, and the mountains grew larger and more magnificent as the bus traveled on. Then the road curved around into a beautiful bowl-shaped valley, ringed by the snowy mountains. To Ted, the place looked like paradise, an earthly scene of heaven, a land of pure wonder. The bus passed by several grand buildings that reminded him of Swiss chalets he'd seen in pictures, and then it came to a stop beside the largest building in the valley. It looked to be made of rough redwood. Ted got off the bus, walked straight to the side of the building, and then inexplicably reached out to scratch his fingernail across the surface, feeling a sense of surprise. The dreamscape changed, and Ted saw himself wearing some sort of uniform. A middle-aged man was talking to him, but Ted couldn't make out the words. There was a woman with light brown hair nearby, dressed in a maid's outfit, and he also saw a chubby, smiling woman sitting behind a cashier's desk. He was in a small room cluttered with trays, and beyond that was a huge dining area filled with guests. A band played dance music in the background, and through the window Ted could see a frozen rink where skaters wove smoothly among one another on the ice. That's where the dream always ended. What it meant, Ted didn't know, but each time it returned the details were identical. He treasured those dreams that were such a beautiful part of his private world, throughout high school and into his first year of college. He didn't have Jill, but at least he had the magnificent valley, if only in his dreams. After high school, Ted enrolled at the University of Alabama. Jill decided upon another college, but they maintained their friendship with frequent letters and phone calls. His heart still responded only to her, so that at a time when most young men would be dating a number of girls, Ted had no interest in campus romance. Besides, he was rather in awe of those sophisticated students with whom he attended classes. They all seemed to have done so much more, traveled to different places, to have lived more exciting lives than he had. All he'd really ever known were the farms and small towns of backwoods Alabama. He had never been taught to question his life or his place in the world. People planted their crops, worked at their jobs, tended their families, and went to church on Sundays, and that was the meaning of existence. But college life exposed Ted to other possibilities. Students from bigger towns like Tuscaloosa and Birmingham knew a lot more than Ted, and he became curious to know more himself. Whatever strange events that had occurred in his past were forgotten in the dazzle of his present new world, and he felt the first stirrings of an exploring mind. He wanted to discover a greater universe than that which he'd known on the farm. Toward the end of his second year, some of Ted's friends began to talk about their summer plans, and he realized that like most of them, he, too, needed help to pay for schooling. That meant finding a job. Something he had never had to think about before. His roommate told him about the fun he'd had working at a resort, and the idea caught Ted's imagination. That spring, then, Ted went to the student placement office on campus to meet with a counselor. He sat in the waiting room, listening for his name to be called, and thumbed through magazines. As he scanned the pages disinterestedly, an advertisement grabbed his attention. It was a picture of a mountainous area, with ponds for ice skaters and snow-covered slopes upon which glamorous people skied. "Come to Sun Valley, Idaho, for the vacation of a lifetime," the caption read. Ted was mesmerized by the scene. He decided that Sun Valley was the resort for him, and when he was ushered into the counselor's office, he laid the magazine down before her and announced his desire to work there. "You and every other kid in America," she replied. "I've been in this office for years, Ted, and we've tried many, many times to get summer jobs in Sun Valley for our students, but we've never succeeded. Never. But I really want to work there," Ted insisted. "Surely there's some way you can help." She shook her head. "That's where the rich people take their vacations, and lots of celebrities have homes there. The wealthiest people use their connections to get jobs for their own children. That's how exclusive the place is. Once we persuaded a congressman to pull some strings for us, but he failed, too." Watching Ted's face fall in disappointment, the counselor tried to be realistic yet encouraging. "It's a waste of time, Ted," she said gently. "Let's focus on what we can do, not on the impossible. I have several places you might be interested in, though. Any one of them would be fun." She took out a folder and leafed through job listings, showing Ted a variety of resorts and vacation ranches in the South. And she gave him application forms, telling him to fill them out and return them to her for mailing the following week. Ted dutifully filled out the forms. When he went back a few days later to turn them in, however, he was still thinking of the beautiful place he had seen in the ad. That photo had captured his heart, and he couldn't give up on it. "I know you don't want to do this," he told the counselor wistfully, "but I'd really appreciate it if we could send a letter out to Sun Valley anyway, just for the heck of it." The counselor sighed and then shrugged. "If it will make you feel better, we will," she finally replied. "But don't be too disappointed, Ted. I've already explained the situation to you." "Yes, ma'am," he nodded. "Now, you probably won't hear anything back from these resorts for a couple of weeks. And if nothing comes through on the first try, I'll make a phone call for you to one place where I do have a good connection, a ranch in Georgia." She smiled as Ted turned to leave. "We'll get something for you by summer, I assure you." The semester was drawing to a close, and after mailing out his applications, Ted had to concentrate on preparations for final exams. It was a time of anxiety as students hurried through their tests and began packing up to leave for the summer. Ted watched this activity enviously, for unlike the others, he didn't have anywhere to go. His family had recently moved into Tuscaloosa, so Ted lived at home while going to classes. Without a summer job elsewhere, he'd have to spend those months there, too. One day after finishing a final exam, Ted came home and was greeted at the door by his mother. She handed him a telegram, and Ted ripped it open curiously. As he read the words, his eyes grew wide, and then he broke out in a huge grin. "Your application to Sun Valley accepted," he read aloud. "Notify of day you can start, no later than June 1st. There was a name at the bottom and a phone number he was advised to contact. Wonderful forces seemed to be at work in his world, he felt, for his impossible wish had been granted. The beautiful picture in the ad flashed into his mind, and he imagined himself as one of the skiers flying down those snowy slopes. He'd never skied before, but so what? The world was a miraculous place, after all, and there was nothing he couldn't do. Ted immediately dialed the number in the telegram and reached a railroad office. The railroad owned the Sun Valley Resort, he found out, and they would arrange his transportation there at no cost. "Let me know what day you can leave," the manager told him, "and the nearest train station." "That would be Birmingham," Ted replied. "Fine. When you get everything set, call me and I'll have a rail pass waiting for you." Ted hung up the phone in a daze. The rest of the day, he was so excited that he couldn't concentrate on anything. Studying was out of the question and he almost failed the next exam. As soon as there was a break in his schedule, Ted took the telegram and rushed to the placement office. "Look," he announced joyously, waving the telegram in the counselor's face. "I did it. They gave me the job." He could hardly contain himself as the dumbfounded counselor read the precious piece of paper, wondering who this young man might be and what made him able to achieve the impossible. In spite of his exuberance, though, Ted had no real grasp of how unusual this job offer was. He thought only of all the plans he had to make. After completing the last exam, Ted packed a few of his belongings and went to Birmingham, picked up his pass, and began the 2-day journey to Idaho. It might as well have been the moon, his parents feared, apprehensive about the great distance that would separate them from their son. But Ted was looking forward, not back at what he was leaving behind. He was too naive to imagine what a very different person he would be the next time he saw his parents. The long train ride was never boring to Ted, as he watched the familiar countryside pass away. Gone were the pine forests and hot rural farms, replaced by vistas that widened and flattened out across the Great Plains to the west. Then these, too, were transformed when the majestic Rocky Mountains emerged, looming far ahead. He watched, enraptured, letting the train carry his body forward and upward, into forested altitudes as his spirit soared even higher. His old reality seemed to fade away until Ted felt as if he were in some waking dream. And when 2,000 miles lay behind him, separating him from his past, the train pulled into Shoshone, Idaho, and Ted stepped down into a new world. The station manager gave him directions to a bus station, explaining that the rest of the trip to Sun Valley would be by road. Ted walked through the small, sparse town, so foreign to his experience, and tried to absorb every new detail. The landscape had a different color, the people on the streets dressed in ways Ted had never seen before, even the air smelled new and strange, and he relished it all. He was proud of himself, impressed by his own audacity and adventure in taking on such a great unknown. A couple of hours later, the bus arrived at the station, and Ted froze in place as he watched the huge, yellow Greyhound-type vehicle pull into the loading zone. No, he told himself, it can't be, and he shook off the eerie feeling that had begun to move up his spine. He loaded his luggage on board, and the old bus lurched off northward. Ted could see snowy mountains ahead in the distance, like beacons. As the journey continued, he settled back for the ride, and that was when he noticed his position, halfway back from the driver. Looking around, he saw that the few other passengers were absorbed in their own thoughts, paying him no attention. Ted felt strange, almost disoriented, as the entire scene set up an echo in his mind. And then the bus braked and pulled to a slow stop. He sat there a moment, fighting a growing sense of apprehension, until he glanced out the window and saw that the road ahead was filled with sheep. Hundreds of them, herded by cowboys on horseback. He couldn't make a sound, he could hardly breathe, and when a small chuckwagon rolled by, Ted actually felt faint. Through the open window, he heard the strange language of the cowboys, unknown words he'd heard so many times before. "What are they saying?" he whispered to another passenger. "Why are they talking so funny?" "They're Basques, from Spain," the person replied. "They herd sheep all over this region." The sheep traversed the road, and the bus resumed its journey. Off to the side ran a sparkling stream, where fishermen cast their lines in mute concentration, and Ted watched them in stunned silence. The road curved around the base of the snowy mountains and then opened up into the beautiful bowl-shaped valley that Ted knew would be there. He was no longer apprehensive, but the amazement that gripped him was thrilling. Scattered throughout the valley were elegant buildings that might have been transported there from the Swiss Alps, and small lakes dotted the landscape, sending up glittering reflections of the mountains ringing the valley. The bus stopped in front of the largest building, a huge structure faced in rough redwood. When he stepped down from the bus, Ted was moving under some other volition than his own. His luggage forgotten, he walked directly to the nearest wall of the lodge, reached out his hand, and scratched a fingernail against it. The redwood was an illusion, he discovered in surprise, chipping away the paint to reveal the cement reality beneath it. Very clearly, Ted should have learned that appearance was not always what it seemed, but he was too shocked to take note of the lesson. Playing out the well-rehearsed scenario, Ted was propelled forward, to the personnel office, where the manager handed him a key to the employee dorm. The next stop was at the lodge office to get his assignment as a busboy in the room service division, and Ted stared at the uniform he was given, remembering how often he had seen it before. Whatever happened after that, his unpacking in the dorm room and falling asleep immediately upon hitting the bed, Ted could never remember clearly. But the next morning when he went to report for his first day on the job, he almost fell over in surprise as a middle-aged man greeted him and took him around to meet the other employees. There was the brunette waitress in her familiar lodge uniform. There was the chubby, jovial cashier behind her well-known desk. He turned and looked into the great dining room where guests chatted, spotting the bandstand in the background. And then he was guided by Bert, his new boss, back into the work area, filled with empty trays. A thought, so distant as to be almost imperceptible, whispered in his mind. See and believe. You are watched over. You are special. You are ours. It is we who have given this to you. We will give you more. He didn't really know if he had heard these words or imagined them, but Ted did feel special. He wondered who had brought him all those dreams. About this valley. Whom could he thank? No matter where he turned, Ted couldn't escape from the dream that was unfolding, in every last detail, all around him. And he didn't want to escape. His Paradise Valley was real, and Ted found himself welcomed into a literal heaven on earth at last. 8. I had a dream which was not all a dream. Lord Byron. There are moments in life when everything changes. We turn a corner, make a choice, and the path we were on is left behind forever. In Ted's life, that moment came when he arrived in Sun Valley. For years he'd been shown a dream in which every detail of this moment was clear, but he had no idea of its importance. And he never realized that some force was at work, shaping his life for unknown purposes. When unusual things had occurred before, Ted simply dismissed them from his mind, for there was no larger context into which they fit or made sense. He had even come to think that his meeting with the angels who merged his soul with Jill's must have been merely a dream. For Jill, after all, hadn't responded with transformed emotions as he had. But now, watching his recurrent dream emerge into living reality in Sun Valley, Ted felt his understanding of the world shaking. What was it, he kept wondering, that had shown him those dreams? What had brought him here to this place and given him the position that so many others before him had tried and failed to obtain? That initial wonderment soon passed, however, as the dazzling surroundings and fast pace of life in Sun Valley bewitched him. It was nothing like the life he had back in Alabama. He was on his own for the very first time, a young man easily accepted by the other employees, making friends from all over the country and rubbing elbows with people of importance and fame. How could he not be impressed by it all? Out on the rink he watched Peggy Fleming skate, and in the lodge he served such celebrities as Andy Williams, Anne Southern, and Lucille Ball. He got to know the Hemingway family, whose home in Ketchum made them frequent visitors to the valley. And he was even called upon to babysit with the children of the famous guests, such as Janet Leigh's young daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis. He was also surrounded by another wonderful attraction, the overwhelming beauty of the place. Ted spent much of his summer wandering through the mountains, exploring the nature trails that led far from the valley into a world of wild majesty and tranquil isolation. The little cotton patch kid who had once chased rabbits in the fields now roamed through mountain meadows with a renewed appreciation of the great creative force of the universe. Sometimes as he lay back to rest from the climbing, Ted gazed down upon the valley below and felt that he was peering into paradise. The summer passed by swiftly and happily. Ted's job at the lodge was so enjoyable that he almost felt guilty to be paid for it. His coworkers were friendly and stimulating, and among them Ted was rather special, with his unique southern drawl and infectious good humor. Every day was so filled with excitement and fun that he didn't think about tomorrow, until at last the summer season began to draw to a close. One day in August, Ted's boss Bert called him over to discuss plans for organizing the winter season crew. He needed to know who would be available after the month-long shutdown before the lodge reopened in October. Ted suddenly realized that his stay in paradise was about to end, and for the first time since arriving he had to think about going back to Alabama and the university. Every time he thought about boarding the train and heading south, he felt sick. His whole being resisted the idea, and finally he sat down to write a letter home, informing his family that he would not be coming back. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, he explained, where he could take advantage of free skiing privileges, flying down the winter slopes with movie stars and moguls. He had new friends from all over the world, he told them, and besides, the university would always be there. Nothing would make him leave, he insisted, at least not yet. Ted also wrote to Jill, for the first time since arriving in Sun Valley, and let her know of his plans. She replied immediately, berating Ted for not contacting her sooner with such great news. "If I had known you were taking this job," she wrote, "I would have come out to Idaho with you for the summer." Surprised by this enthusiasm, Ted wrote again, explaining how quickly the job offer had come, that he simply hadn't had time to inform her. He said he missed her, that he cared about her as much as ever. And he pointed out how little they'd actually seen each other anyway, with the distance between the two universities they attended. Ted thought it odd that Jill would have wanted to accompany him to Idaho, since there had never been any romance between them, but he didn't dwell on her letter. Instead, he looked forward to the break between seasons in which he could travel a bit and see even more of the country. All thoughts of Alabama were forgotten. A few days before his vacation started, however, there was a knock at Ted's door. He opened it and saw Jill standing there with a smile and a suitcase. "Hi," she said, giving him a quick hug, "I missed you. I've got a couple of weeks before school starts, and everything you wrote about this place just sounded fantastic, so I wanted to see it for myself. Aren't you glad I'm here, Teddy?" "Well, sure," he replied, once the shock of the moment passed. "But why didn't you let me know you were coming? I wanted to surprise you." She laughed. "You're going to have a break soon, aren't you? We can have a great time before I go back home." She hugged him again, and Ted felt a renewal of familiar feelings of love for her. "Yeah," he said, "we can have a wonderful time, Jill." Ted took her on a tour of the valley, proudly introducing her to his friends, flattered that she had come so far just to be with him. He showed her around as if he owned the place. Everyone seemed to like Jill immediately. Even Bert warmed to her after a few minutes, going so far as to offer her a waitressing job if she wanted to stay on for the winter. Ted laughed at the prospect, but Jill's prompt acceptance of the offer caught him by surprise. "What about school?" he sputtered, "and what will your family say, for heaven's sake?" "I don't care what they think," Jill said. "If you can stay out here and forget about college for a while, so can I. You're my best friend, Ted, and we'll have a great time together." Ted didn't argue anymore. With Jill in Sun Valley, his paradise would be perfect. The love he had felt for her since he was 14 had never died. And when the lodge closed down for September, Ted and Jill set off to explore the world. They traveled west through Utah, Oregon, and Washington, places they never dreamed they would see. All the restraints of their past were broken, the world was new and unlimited, and they were answerable to nobody but themselves. Somewhere along their journey, Ted and Jill crossed another boundary, moving from friends to lovers. It seemed to Ted there was nothing more he could ask from life, and he thanked the angels who had destined them for one another. They drank in everything, the new sights, new cities, and their new relationship. When the vacation ended, they rode back to Sun Valley, exhausted but exhilarated, to prepare for the winter season. It was a non-stop round of fun, punctuated only by easy stints on the job. Many of Ted's summer friends had stayed on for the winter, and there were other new employees to meet. Camaraderie was high as they all trooped into town after work, to dance and drink and party in the local bars with the energy of youth. Jill especially loved the nightlife, and although she and Ted had never been exposed to such freedom, or perhaps because of that, she grabbed it recklessly. The quiet, proper young girl Ted had loved in Alabama transformed into an outgoing woman full of zest, who could drink and dance until the bar closed down. Ted's stamina, however, soon reached its limit. At first he partied and drank with sheer exhilaration, but coming home drunk every night, grabbing a few hours sleep in his room and then trying to work his shift with a hangover soon diminished his enthusiasm. He was young and healthy, but keeping up with Jill, he came to realize, could kill a horse. The next night when Jill came to get him for their usual trip into town, Ted suggested they stay home instead and get a little rest for a change. "But I'm not tired," she laughed. "Come on, everybody's already down there. Let's go." "No, really, not tonight," he shook his head. "They won't miss us this once." "Well, I'll miss them," Jill said with a hint of anger. "What do you want to do around here, anyway?" "Read?" "Yeah, maybe I will," he replied. "But you go on if you like, with everybody else, and maybe I'll see you later." He could tell Jill was determined to party, and just because he wasn't didn't mean that she shouldn't have some fun. "Fine," Jill said flippantly. "Enjoy your book, Ted." Then she was out the door and gone without a backward look. He felt guilty for a moment. Jill was young and free, determined to make up for all the years she'd spent being serious and responsible and good. If she wanted to overindulge a little, Ted told himself, well, then, why not? He understood, or at least he thought he did. But he was more mature himself, an old hand at this fast-lane living, with 4 whole months of freedom under his belt. He was a veteran now of making life-changing decisions, and when he had opted to drop out of college, Ted had begun to see other possibilities for the future. As he watched the daily operations of the lodge, he was surprised to find that the business side of things actually interested him. While in college, his studies had no particular direction, and career decisions seemed far in the distance. Observing an enterprise like Sun Valley Lodge from the inside was an eye-opener. He had always had a good head for numbers, and he soon realized that such a skill could be made to pay. The financial and practical side of business was easy for him to grasp. It seemed a good idea to find out all he could about it, so Ted began to study. He was over 20 years old, and it was time to think about his future. Someone had given him a book, The Peter Principle, by Lawrence J. Peter, and that night he read the first few pages with rapt attention. A knock at the door sometime later surprised him, and Ted glanced up. The clock said it was much later than he thought. The door opened, and Jill walked in, a bit wobbly. "Hey, Ted," she said, "you really missed the fun tonight." She plopped down on the bed and reeled backward, laughing as Ted reached out to catch her. "Yeah, and you're going to hurt tomorrow," he replied. "I'm putting you to bed before you fall down and break something. Come on, hold on to me." He got her to her feet and started down the hall to the women's wing, but Jill was difficult to control in her inebriated condition. "Wish you had been there," she said, bouncing against him playfully. "I would have had lots more fun with you." "If you had had any more fun," he told her, "you'd be crawling, Jill." They squeezed through the doorway into her room, and Ted helped her lie down in the dark. She tried to say something as he pulled a blanket up over her, but then she rolled over and passed out. The next night, Ted went with Jill to the bar, and this time he made a point to notice just how much she drank. When she ordered the 4th one, he suggested then maybe she had had enough, but Jill ignored him. By the time she finished off her 5th, Ted couldn't get her to sit down. She wanted to dance, and if Ted wouldn't do it, there were plenty of others who would. "No," he insisted. "Let's go home now. You've worn me out." Jill pulled away defiantly. "Forget it," she said. "You're not any fun." "What's wrong with you?" "I can't do this anymore," he replied in exasperation. "I've had enough, and I'm leaving. If you want to come with me, you better get your things now." He turned to go, but Jill didn't budge. Ted hesitated only a moment and then walked out the door alone. Snow had started to fall, but he hardly noticed. The chill he felt was somewhere in his heart. His hand went up to his chest, and for a brief moment he thought of the angel's touch there. The Jill he had been made to love was not the girl he'd just left in the bar. After work the next evening, Ted wondered if Jill would come down and ask him to go out. By 9 p.m., when she hadn't appeared, his curiosity won out, and he went to the women's wing. Jill's room was empty. It was much later when she finally showed up at his door, slightly inebriated, and made a conciliatory gesture. Nothing more was said after that, but they both knew the old routine had changed. Jill went to the bar most nights by herself or with some of the others. Ted stayed home, and then Jill would pop in for a quick good night when she returned. During the day, their relationship seemed the same, though, and Ted hoped the crisis was over. One night when he had nothing in particular to do, he decided to go down to the bar and surprise her. He trudged through the cold night into town, and by the time he reached the bar he was ready for a warming drink and maybe a workout on the dance floor. He moved from table to table, looking for Jill without any luck. Finally one of his coworkers waved him over, and Ted sat down. "It's been a while since you were out here," his friend remarked. "Let me pay for that one, okay?" he offered as Ted ordered a beer, his usual indulgence, from the waitress. "Thanks," Ted said. "You haven't seen Jill, have you?" "Nope, not tonight," the friend replied. "Thought maybe the two of you were having a private party." Ted laughed and shook his head. Everyone knew that he and Jill were a couple, but since she'd been coming to the bar alone, their intimate late-night romancing had waned. That's why he was there now, hoping to share Jill's fun and then return to the dorm together. Really together, for the first time in weeks. He had a couple of beers and waited for an hour or more, watching for her. But at last it was obvious that Jill was elsewhere, so reluctantly he walked back to the lodge alone. It was almost 1 a.m. by the time he arrived. Before going to his own room, Ted stopped by Jill's and started to knock. The muffled sound of voices inside made him hesitate a moment, but he tapped lightly and pushed the door open. In the dim light, the first thing he saw was his roommate, Gary, sitting on the couch with his arm around someone. Jill. They were kissing, but when the door opened they both looked up in surprise. Jill started after him as Ted backed slowly out of the room, but the look on his face warned her not to follow. 30 minutes later, Ted was back in town, at the first liquor store he saw. Then he went on, to a small hotel, checked in, and proceeded to empty the bottle he had bought. He couldn't quit crying, and the alcohol didn't stop his pain, but at last he passed out on the bed. 2 days later when he finally returned to the lodge, Bert was alarmed and angry. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. "You missed your shift yesterday, and you don't look like you can work today, either." "That's not like you, Ted, to be so irresponsible." "I'm sorry," Ted said miserably. "You know I'm always on time, Bert. I've never let you down before. But this was personal. I had to have some time alone to think about things." "Am I fired?" "No, you're not fired," Bert replied, and from the tone of his voice, Ted guessed that his boss must have heard something about the situation. "You're one of my best workers. I think I can let it go this time. But make sure I know where you are before you disappear again, okay?" "Okay," Ted nodded. "It won't happen again." "Thanks, Bert." When his shift ended, Ted reluctantly headed for the dorm, uncertain what would happen when he confronted Gary. That was the first thing he had to get through. Dealing with Jill was more than he could think about just then. But when he got to his room, it was clear that Gary had moved out. In a way, Ted was relieved, but part of him wanted the confrontation. He had been betrayed by a good friend, and he wanted to know why. Gary wasn't hard to find. Half an hour later they were alone together in Gary's new room, and when Ted looked at his friend's embarrassed expression, his anger relented. "Man, I'm really sorry." "Really sorry, Ted," Gary said. No, that's not much help." "I trusted you," Ted said. "Jill was my girl, and you were my friend. How could you do that to me?" Listen, Gary replied, I never meant for this to happen. But Jill can be real persuasive. She brought a bottle down to the room, looking for you, but I was there, and she stayed a while. Didn't you think about me? Ted asked. If you wanted a girl, there are plenty around here besides mine. Sure I did, Gary argued. I even asked Jill why she was flirting with me when she was your steady. And you know what? She laughed and said she didn't belong to you, that she loved you like a friend, that's all. She said she was free due to what she wanted, and so were you. Ted didn't listen to any more. He walked away, determined to find Jill and hear it for himself. He couldn't believe that her interest in Gary was serious, in spite of what he'd seen in her room. The only way he would really know was to see her face, look into her eyes, and listen to her explanation. If she had one. By the time he found her, Ted's obsessive need for Jill was raging, and he was desperate to believe anything she said. He wanted her back, the old Jill who loved him, whose soul had been merged with his. If she said she was sorry, he knew he would forgive her. Jill didn't look pleased to see him when he walked into her room. What do you want? She asked angrily. This wasn't what Ted expected, and for a moment he couldn't answer. I want to know what happened, he finally managed to say. What do you care? She flared. You've ignored me for weeks. All you do is work and read and wander around in the mountains by yourself. I want to live it up and have fun. And I'm going to. The guys around here know how to have a good time, even if you've forgotten. I'm finally away from that small southern town, with everybody meddling in my business. My family just smothered me. For the first time in my life, I feel free and alive, and I'm going to enjoy every minute of it, with or without you. But, Jill, what about us? Ted pleaded. What does this mean? How can you say this? You know we're meant to be together. Look, she said, we grew up together, schooled together, churched together, so of course I love you, Ted. How could I not love you? You're my best friend. And I've tried to love you the way you wanted. But all of this business with the angels and our souls being merged, Ted, that's your obsession. Those were your angels, not mine. Like a dry twig breaking underfoot, Ted felt something snap inside. He waited for the surge of pain he thought he would feel. Jill had finally and completely rejected him, but astonishingly the pain was gone. Her words, honest and brutal, had freed him, and there was nothing left of her soul in him, not anymore. The obsession was over. 9. My soul hath power to know all things, yet is she blind and ignorant in all. Sir John Davies. Jill left before Christmas. The holiday season was one of the busiest times at the lodge, and Ted took on extra shifts at work, leaving himself less time to think, or hurt. But the hour always came when he couldn't ignore his loneliness. Questions and doubts crowded him, born for the first time from his heart as well as his mind. How did a God work, he wondered, with angels who could make such a colossal, messy mistake? How could a loving God choose to bind him, his very soul, to a woman who would bring such misery upon them both? The obsession was broken, the angels had failed. Throughout the winter, Ted withdrew, isolated in his own thoughts, coming to terms with the meaning of betrayal and loss. He had little contact with his friends and sought instead a world beyond the human. There were always the mountains, ringing the valley like monuments to calm endurance, and for Ted they were a place of healing. In time, then, he came back to himself. The pain matured into experience, and Ted was able to rejoin the social world of the lodge with renewed gusto. His good humor returned, but there was a new seriousness belying it and new questions that Ted could not yet formulate. All he knew for sure was that things in the world were capable of illusion. Things could appear to be one way yet in reality be something altogether different. Cement could look like redwood. Like Jill's love. Like the soul mating of the angels. The loyalty of a friend. He knew the world was not what he saw with his senses, but he didn't know what lay beyond or behind it. And he didn't know how to find out. Still, with all the recuperative qualities of health and a strong spirit, Ted got back into the swing of parties and friends. He skied down the winter slopes as often as he could get away from the job. He quit thinking about Jill every day, pushing it all farther and farther behind him. Until at last the ache felt dim and remote. His friends welcomed back the old Ted, and he threw himself into everything, including his work, with a zest. In addition to his room service employment, he was frequently hired out by the lodge to cater private parties for some of the valley's most prestigious guests. There, winter was a time of non-stop social gatherings, and everyone who was anyone, from movie stars to international tycoons, gave at least one big bash before the season ended. One of the most genial families wintering in Sun Valley were the owners of a pharmaceutical company, whose large chalet was a crown jewel of the resort area. And when their turn came to host the big party, they hired the lodge caterers. Ted was one of a dozen employees sent to the chalet, all dressed in their best uniforms. His job was to serve drinks to the 100 or so guests gathered at the luxurious home, and his buddy Robert tended the bar. As Ted brought in the drink orders, he noticed that several guests asked for a drink that looked quite enticing, garnished with an orange slice and a cherry. They called it an old-fashioned, something Ted had never heard of, and he thought it looked delicious. "What's that taste like?" he asked Robert as he loaded another round of glasses on the tray. "Super," Robert said. "You want me to fix you one?" "I'm not supposed to drink while I'm working," Ted replied hesitantly, eyeing the glasses. "Who's going to know?" Robert smiled. "Here, I'll fix it, and you just set the glass out of the way somewhere. Then you can sneak over for a sip whenever you're not busy." "Scotch or bourbon?" "I don't know," Ted shrugged. "What's the difference?" His knowledge of alcohol began and ended primarily with beer. "Never mind," Robert said. "I think you'd probably like the bourbon." "Okay," Ted relented. "I'll have one." When the drink was ready, he took it and slipped around a large potted plant, away from view. Ted sniffed the glass curiously and then stuck his tongue in for a taste. Not bad, he thought, not bad at all. It was so good, in fact, that he downed the entire thing in one long swallow and sauntered out from behind the big plant with a smile. When he'd taken more orders from the guests, Ted went back to the bar. "So, what did you think?" Robert asked. "That was great," Ted said. "I believe I'll have another one." Robert set him up again, and Ted soon polished off the second old-fashioned, beginning to feel rather warm and cheery. For the next hour or so, he managed to sneak several more drinks from the bar and still keep up with his duties. The party grew more animated, and so did Ted, who by this time was seeing everything in a happy, rosy glow. He didn't recall ever having enjoyed a catering job so much, moving in and out among the jolly guests with a growing feeling of kinship and camaraderie. Among the guests arriving just then was Ann Southern, one of the Sun Valley regulars whom Ted had gotten to know from working some of her private get-togethers. Amused by his great sense of humor and enthralled by his thick Alabama accent, Miss Southern liked this young man from the South. They had reached such a friendly relationship that she even nicknamed him Bama and requested him personally for her parties. The door opened, and Ted saw Miss Southern enter. "Anne," he called out with a wave, "good to see you." He was oblivious to the response of the other guests, thanks to the alcohol haze enveloping him. Miss Southern smiled in recognition and greeted him with a hug. Ted ran back to the bar and brought her the drink he knew she preferred, as well as another old-fashioned for himself, and while the party's hosts stared with open mouths, the two of them chatted amiably in the middle of the room. It was impossible not to notice the famous movie star talking and laughing with the uniformed waiter as if they were old friends. By this time, Ted had forgotten that he was supposed to be serving, not mingling, and when another waiter passed by with a tray full of drinks, he helped himself. Miss Southern led him over to the sofa, and before long a large group had gathered around them. "Honey, come here," Miss Southern called out to a friend. "Come listen to this guy talk. He's just wonderful. Listen to this." Bama, she said, turning to Ted, say something for Mary, dear. And Ted performed, playing up his down-home drawl for all it was worth. One of the other waiters tried to lure him away from the crowd and back to work, but Ted could have cared less. To hell with that, he laughed, too drunk to realize just how plastered he really was. He was having a great time, the center of attention, and no one at the party enjoyed it more than he did. Eventually, however, the festivities were over, the guests departed, and the catering crew was left to clean up the debris. Weaving around with a silly grin on his face, Ted watched as all the others loaded up the supplies in the Sun Valley van. All the expensive china and crystal were fitted into tall stacking compartments, and then the employees clambered aboard to go back to the lodge. Bert, the boss, reached out and grabbed Ted by the coat, pulling him inside. Even in his condition, Ted noticed that Bert wasn't smiling. In fact, he glared at Ted with a very angry expression as the van rolled off down the road. It wasn't easy for Ted to remain upright in the moving vehicle and to think at the same time, but he held onto the side rails and bobbed along, wondering what was wrong with his boss. Bert glowered at him with fire in his eyes. I just want to know what you've got to say for yourself, he muttered angrily. Ted looked at him blankly, gave a little lurch, and then vomited explosively all over everything. The other employees jumped away, and Ted fell back sprawling into the stacks of dishes. The back door of the van flew open under his pressure, and trays full of china and crystal bounced out, trailing broken glass in the wake. Miraculously, nobody tumbled out in the uproar that followed, although Bert was clearly tempted to toss Ted out along with the mess he had made. It was 2 full days before Ted recovered, 2 painful days in which he kept to his bed with ice packs on his head, gobbling medicine made by the hosts of the party, and fervently praying that they wouldn't fire for impertinence on the job. In spite of the pain and humiliation, though, he had relished his fling at the party. He loved the fast pace of the valley, and he didn't ever want to leave. When Bert finally relented and forgave him, Ted was grateful and more devoted than ever to carrying out his duties. Winter passed, the summer season opened, and the routine of work once again paced his life. If his destiny didn't lie in love, maybe he'd find himself a different challenge. With its own risks and rewards. Ted went back to his business studies in the off hours with a renewed sense of determination. But some of the habits he developed during his solitary period stayed with him. He spent much of his spare time hiking through the nature trails, gaining more from his surroundings than from his studies. His heart and soul expanded in nature. Birds and animals came to him willingly and fearlessly, recognizing a kinship with him. Ted saw nothing unusual in this, but his friends, witnessing the rapport between Ted and the wildlife, knew it was remarkable. The new season brought more new employees, energizing the social scene, but Ted had no desire to find any new romantic interests. He had dealt with Jill, he had got back his emotional balance, and he was in no hurry to risk upsetting it. Again, his buddies were enough for now, and the things he studied kept him well occupied. As far as he was concerned, life in his personal paradise was just fine. But balance, like everything else in the world, can be a fragile illusion. One day, rounding a corner in the hall with an armful of trays, Ted literally lost his equilibrium and banged into a young woman with a clatter. "Hey, I'm awfully sorry," he said, gathering up the pile of trays from the floor. "That's okay," she said lightly, and Ted looked up to see an exotically beautiful woman gazing down at him with a smile. She was 18, maybe 19, he judged, and a perfect beauty. Fine, elegant features, cascading warm, brown hair, skin of a most unusual coppery tan, and dark, dark eyes that hinted of the Orient. Ted was struck dumb in awe, and when the girl passed by him with another smile and a wave, he just nodded. Dressed in a waitress uniform, she disappeared into the hall, and Ted collected the last of the trays and headed into the workroom. "What happened to you?" one of the other waiters asked. "Run into a bus?" "No, a girl," Ted grinned. "And just wait till you see her." You're not going to believe this one. He watched throughout the lodge complex for the next few days, hoping to see her again. But he had no luck. He wasn't even sure that she worked inside the lodge itself, with all the other facilities in the valley. Giving up on his quest, Ted returned to his habit of mountain walks, and on the very first one, about a quarter of a mile up the path, Ted saw the beautiful young woman sitting beneath a tree beside the trail. She was alone, and she waved to him silently, smiling. Ted waved back and continued up the trail, suddenly shy. He had been very surprised to see her there. He almost never met other hikers at this time of day, and he thought it was a rare coincidence. Ted reconsidered and decided to go back and talk to her, but when he reached the tree, he was again too shy to speak. At last the woman got up and walked toward him. "Hello," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Maya, and I'm new here." "Where are you from?" "Alabama." "My name is Ted Rice." "Your accent is rather different, isn't it?" she laughed. Ted laughed, too, and relaxed. "Well, yours is pretty different, too," he said. "It isn't Southern, but you don't sound like the people from around here, either." "Where are you from?" "Oh, my people live up in the mountains," she replied with a vague wave of her hand. "I'll tell you all about them sometime. What brings you to Sun Valley? And tell me all about Alabama." Her manner was very mature, Ted noticed, considering her young age. She was much more self-confident than most of the girls he knew, and he intuited a strength and serenity in her that put him at ease. They sat down beneath the tree together, and Ted began talking, pleased that this gorgeous woman found him so interesting. He told her of his cotton fields and childhood escapades, even of his dreams of Sun Valley years before his arrival there. Maya smiled at this account, encouraging him to continue. She watched his gestures and listened attentively, as if each word were important. But when Ted realized that almost 2 hours had passed, he was a little ashamed of having dominated the conversation. In all fairness, he had tried several times to ask Maya some personal questions and draw her out, but she always replied in generalities and gently steered the focus back upon him. At last Maya said she had to leave for work, so they parted, and Ted went back along the nature trail alone. As he walked and thought about the chance encounter, he realized that in a very short time he had told her many things about himself. Yet from her all he had learned was her first name and that she came from the mountains. He chided himself for forgetting even to ask her last name. It was almost a week later before he ran into her again. They were rushing past each other in the kitchen hall, but Ted managed to delay her long enough to ask if they could make a date. Maybe go to a movie in town sometime. "Sorry, Ted," Maya declined. "I have to work tonight." "What about later, then?" "Another night." "Just name the date," he persisted. "We can go out any time you'd like." Maya walked away from him. "Don't worry," she called back. "We'll see each other soon." "I promise." And then she was gone. Ted left the trays in the kitchen and rushed back to the dining room. He wanted to find out her last name and her dorm, for future reference. But Maya was nowhere in sight. Another waiter passed by, and Ted pulled him aside. "Hey, Jack, you know that beautiful brown-haired girl that just went through here?" he asked. "In a waitress uniform? Which way did she go?" "Can't help you," Jack shrugged. "I didn't see anybody like that around here." "Okay, thanks anyway," Ted said, but he didn't understand how Jack could have missed Maya. He asked the other employees, too, and got the same negative reply. That's how it always seemed to be, a series of sudden appearances and inexplicable vanishings. With Ted as the only witness, Maya kept her word, and they did run into one another thereafter, although not frequently enough to suit Ted. Days would pass without any sign of her, and Ted would just about give up. Then suddenly there she would be, out on the nature trails as if waiting for him. They would walk together and talk, far away from the lodge, deep in conversations unlike anything Ted had ever discussed before. Instead of the usual trivia that made up a young girl's interests and conversations, Maya preferred to talk about feelings and ideas, approaching topics seriously, without the silliness that Ted usually found in 18 and 19-year-old friends. Time after time, she amazed him with her remarkable insights or philosophical questions. And she talked about things that Ted had never considered. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to fly out into space?" she asked him one day as they lay back looking into the sky. "To really see the stars up close?" Ted had not thought about it before, but now he did. Gazing up past the clouds, imagining all the billions of bright stars, he wondered what it would be like to fly through them, careening across the cosmos in pure freedom. It was as if Maya's words had brought that scene into his mind, and it enthralled him. She continually presented some new thought or idea for Ted to ponder. Maya would lay the idea before him, let him play with it for a while, and then guide him through a process of questioning and assessing. Ted was never aware of her influence while it was being exerted, but later he could see how completely she managed the conversations. There was never an opening for him to question her on personal things, either. His deepest thoughts were expanding as a result of their shared explorations, but Maya herself remained as mysterious as ever. Ted wondered why she was always alone when they met. Sometimes he would see her in a hallway, rushing off on some errand. And occasionally he spotted her walking between the lodge and the chalet. He had described Maya to his friends, of course, but after a while they started teasing him, insisting that he had invented the story, since no one but Ted had ever seen the beautiful Maya. Ted laughed with them, but the more he thought about it, the more suspicious the circumstances seemed. He also wondered why she was so difficult to find in the relatively small environs of the valley. Just once he wanted to run into her, instead of the other way around, for invariably Maya was the one who did the finding. Ted determined that the next time he saw her, he would get some answers. Where did she live? Where exactly did she work? And why was she always alone? But the next time he saw her, she wasn't alone. Ted was jogging up a trail, and when he rounded a small bend he saw Maya and another young woman walking toward him. Maya waved, and her smile had a hint of the mischievous about it. "Hi, there," she called out. "You're late, Ted." She had been waiting for him, Ted was certain, but his attention was drawn to the other girl. "Who's this?" he asked, unable to quit staring at Maya's friend. She might have been her twin, with the same surreal complexion and dark hair and eyes. She was equally beautiful, but in a slightly different way, and when she spoke her accent echoed Maya's perfectly. "Hello, Ted," the young woman said. "My name is Lyra. It's nice to meet you. Maya has told me about you." Ted nodded. "Do you work here, too? I've never seen you in the valley before, and believe me, I'm sure I would have noticed." "No," Lyra said, "I don't. Maya is my friend. I'm visiting her now, that's all." Before Ted could ask another question, Maya took Lyra by the arm and walked on down the trail. "You go ahead," she told Ted. "Enjoy your walk. We have to leave now, anyway, I've got to work soon. But I'll see you later, don't worry." He was tempted to follow them back to the valley, hoping to learn more. But something stopped him. Whenever Maya said it was time to go, he had learned that she didn't want him to go with her. She always left as mysteriously as she appeared. At least he knew one thing more about her, he consoled himself. She had friends, and if Lyra was any indication, there were others like her up in the mountains that Maya called home. A few days later, she found him again, out walking the trails as usual. They went along together chatting for a while, when Ted noticed that Maya was carrying a large photo album. He stopped beside a tree and motioned for her to sit down beside him. "What is that?" he asked, pointing at the album. "Oh, that," she replied, as if she'd forgotten all about it. "I want you to look at this, okay? These are all pictures of friends and some people I know. Here, take a look. I'd be interested in your response." Maya placed the album in his lap, and Ted flipped through page after page of large photos, mostly formal portraits. There were people of every age, in a variety of settings. Are you a photographer? He asked, thumbing through the pages. No, Maya said, I didn't take these. A friend of mine shot these photos and gave them to me. These are all people I know. They're sort of different, Ted remarked. I mean, a book of pictures of the people I know sure wouldn't look like this. Most of my friends are younger. Oh, I know all sorts of people, Maya laughed. All of them are interesting. She stopped the page to point at a particular picture of a man. For instance, look at him, she told Ted. What do you think of this man? Well, Ted began, staring at the photo, I guess he looks like a very kind man, a gentle person. How do you know that? Maya asked. It's simple, Ted shrugged. Just look at his eyes. He looks happy, like someone who would be fun in a crowd or a party. From what I know of him, you're correct, Maya smiled. She turned to another photo. This one showing a more mature woman. This is the mother of one of my friends, she explained. What do you think about her? Ted studied the picture a moment and then sighed. Heck, I don't really know, but I think she's had a lot of pain. Look at the expression on her face. This woman has been hurt very badly. Has her husband died recently, or something like that? He looked up at Maya. The only time I've seen that expression in my family, he continued, was when someone had died. As a matter of fact, you're right, Maya nodded. Her husband died not long ago. And this picture was taken right after that. Don't you think it's strange that you would know such a thing? She pointed to another photo, of a young girl, and Ted described unhappiness in the girl's family life as well as the presence of some artistic talent. Another photo, another description followed, and they went on until Maya had asked Ted about every photo in the album. What did he think of them? What did he see in the picture? How did he see into them? How did he know his impressions were valid? Finally Maya closed the album, and Ted sat up, feeling a little disoriented. Those sure are some interesting friends you've got there, he said. They all seem like nice people. I'm glad you have such good friends. It sounded silly, it wasn't at all what he wanted to say after such an experience, but his mind was too rattled for anything more profound. Something didn't feel right inside. Good friends, he repeated, interesting people. Are they all from up in the mountains, too? Maya ignored his question. Do you not realize what you have been doing here, Ted? She asked. Doing what? He echoed evasively. His heart was racing, and something really didn't feel right. Don't you think it's kind of odd, she went on, that you know all this information about people you've never met? The sensations of a queasy stomach and lightheadedness suddenly reversed themselves in Ted's body, and then he went into a fit of stiff resistance to her probing. No, not at all, he insisted. There's no trick to that, it's all obvious. Those things I told you, everything I saw, it's very obvious. Look at them, he pointed, turning the pages furiously. Just look at them. You can see it all in their eyes, anyone can, for Pete's sake. There's nothing odd about that, Maya. Oh, I don't know, Ted. It seems rather special to me. You really think such insights are so obvious? She replied, smiling and unmoved by his outburst. You really think anyone, everyone, can just look at the face and see the sorts of things you did? Yeah, I guess, he said, faltering. Why? Don't you? Maya took his hands and held them firmly between her own. Her smile deepened, and her eyes locked onto his. Did it ever occur to you that maybe you are psychic? That I'm what? Ted asked. The queasiness was rampant now. Psychic, she repeated. Able to read into people's energy and see information about them. I don't think the things you have told me about these people could have been known to you otherwise. But all I did was look at their faces and their eyes, Ted said. All the information was just plain obvious. Surely there's no special talent needed to see that. It is a talent, believe me, Maya continued, a very special ability. Your friends down in the lodge cannot do these things, but you can. How long have you been able to do this? All my life, I guess, Ted replied, bewildered. I just know things about people sometimes, it's true. But, heck, I thought everybody else knew the same things, too, and just didn't feel like saying anything about it. So I didn't, either. In the back of his mind, Ted heard his grandmother's words and her warning, stay away from such things. His balance was still shaky, but he was beginning to recover. Psychic, huh, he said. Are you talking about psychics like that woman up in Washington? You know. That Dixon woman in the newspapers, psychic like that? Yes, I've heard of her, Maya told him. But this is different. Your psychic talent allows you to read people's energy fields. What good is that? Ted asked, puzzled. He had never heard of an energy field, no one he knew had ever talked about psychics, and he wasn't sure what any of this meant. That is something I'm certain you will find out, Maya said. Today, it's enough that you simply know and recognize that you're psychic, Ted. How do you know about these things, anyway? Ted asked. Where did you learn about psychics and energy fields, and outer space, and all those other things you're always talking about? Who are you, Maya, really? What kind of people do you live with, up in those mountains? Why, people just like Lyra and me, of course, she laughed softly. We talk about a lot of things, and we study, too, like you used to do in the university, right? There's so much to understand in the world. Isn't it fascinating? She rose and gathered up the album. I'd love to stay longer and talk some more, she said, but I really can't. It's getting late. I'll see you later, Ted. Maya waved and then headed off down the trail before he could answer. Ted sat there, amazed and bewildered, and watched her fade out of sight. Not only had Maya led him to a new recognition of himself, she also had triggered a sensation of emotion that he hadn't felt since Jill's departure. It felt good, intriguing and enticing, but this time it was different. His emotional response wasn't obsessive or controlling, it was unconditional. 10. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Isaiah. The more Ted thought about Maya's psychic test with the photo album, the more he rejected the notion that he had some special ability. Part of his response was sheer stubbornness. He didn't want to be different from other people, either. He wanted to be a normal guy, have some fun, do a good job, and enjoy his life, that was all. But another part of his mind rejected thoughts of psychic ability because it frightened him, and he didn't understand why. When Ted tried to dismiss it from his thoughts and found he couldn't, he decided to talk to his friends and get their opinions. But even bringing up the subject was difficult, because no one else ever talked about strange things. Sitting in the break room relaxing one evening with a few other employees, he took a chance and asked, "What do y'all think about psychic abilities?" Leanne, Bert, and another waiter, Sydney, reacted in surprise. "You mean, mind reading and stuff like that?" Leanne laughed. "You don't believe in it, do you, Ted?" "Well, no," he hedged, "not really. But this friend of mine, Maya, she told me that I was psychic the other day. And I just don't know what to think." "What makes her think you're psychic?" Bert asked. "She gave me a test," Ted told him. When the others pressed him to explain, he recounted the incident with the photo album. "I told her what I thought about each of the people in the pictures," he concluded, "and Maya said I was correct. Do y'all think there might really be anything to this psychic stuff? Why don't we do a little test of our own?" Sydney offered. He was a waiter like Ted, but he only worked at Sun Valley in the summers. For the rest of the year, Sydney was a college instructor somewhere along the East Coast, and of all the employees, Ted thought that Sydney was probably the smartest and certainly the best educated. So he listened in surprise and curiosity as Sydney explained the sort of test he had in mind. "You think we could try some experiment that would prove I don't have any special powers?" he asked. He wanted to discredit Maya's test and relieve himself of the uneasiness it had stirred up in him. "Who knows?" Sydney countered. "Maybe it will prove that you do. Some people do have psychic abilities, they're able to do things that mere chance says they shouldn't." But I would think that it's a rather rare gift, Ted, and I'm pretty doubtful that you or any of us here would have it. Care to try it anyway? Sure, Ted agreed. If there was a good test, he'd fail it, and that would put an end to Maya's talk. He and everyone else would find out that he was just a typical guy. All right, Sydney began, here's what we'll do. I'll choose a number of items, and you try to guess what they are. I'll select 5 things, one at a time, okay? He motioned for Ted to move back, and Leanne and Bert gathered in close around Sydney to witness the process. You go across the room and turn around, he continued. I'll give you 3 guesses on each item, and if you can get even 3 of them right, out of 9 guesses, I'd say that would be a higher than average performance. If you do that well, I'll concede that you might have some abnormal abilities. The others laughed and joked as Ted crossed the room, and he laughed along with them. There was no way he could guess the objects, he was certain, and they could all have a good time watching him fail. He faced the wall a few moments, while Sydney chose the first item and then called for Ted to turn around. Keep your eyes closed, Sydney directed. Put your hand up to your forehead and try to clear your mind completely. Shut out all thoughts, Ted, and concentrate. I've got something in my hand. Concentrate on getting an image of that. When something comes to mind, tell us what you think. The item is. A young man's dignity is awkward and fragile sometimes, and Ted felt very silly, with his hand dramatically covering his eyes, but he obeyed Sydney's instructions. Tell us, great Swami. Bert joked, and everyone laughed, especially Ted. Ignore them, Sydney said, and just focus on getting an image. Ted squeezed his eyes shut and tried to blank out his thoughts. After a moment he said, well, it's long and yellow. Not too big. He paused and then went on hesitantly. I think, it's a pencil? He opened his eyes and looked at Sydney's outstretched hand. In it was a yellow pencil. His eyes widened in surprise, and then he grinned. Wow, this is really fun, he laughed, feeling a rush of excitement. The pit of his stomach winced as it did whenever he rode a roller coaster climbing to the top of the first deep, dizzying dive of speed. He could feel color and heat rising in his face. Not bad, Bert said. Yeah, Leanne echoed. You're a great guesser. Do you hire out for private parties? Ted laughed again and then turned back to face the wall for a second challenge. Behind him, Leanne and Bert rummaged around for an object. Leanne found a safety pin and handed it to Sydney. Turn around, Ted, Sydney said, and focus on the image of the second item. Ted pressed his hand to his forehead again and cleared his thoughts. Soon, another image began to appear, but it wasn't as clearly obvious as the pencil had been. He sharpened his concentration and tentatively began to give a description. Leanne, Sydney, and Bert sat forward. It's gray, he began. No, not gray, silver. Shiny silver, I think. A coin? No, not a coin. A paperclip? It's about the size of a paperclip. You know, like a safety pin. Ted opened his eyes, and when Sydney handed him the safety pin, he bowed his head in acknowledgement. This time, there wasn't as much laughter from the others as before. Bert just stared at him open-mouthed. Ted was beginning to enjoy this little test less and less. The rush of excitement he felt when he identified the pencil now felt like a rush of something much less pleasant. This wasn't the way the test was supposed to proceed. 2 guesses, and 2 correct answers, Sydney finally said, breaking the silence. That's pretty amazing, Ted. He looked at the young man before him as if scanning for signs of something that had been overlooked before. His close attention made Ted want to squirm. Yeah, this is fun, Ted lied, all his enthusiasm gone. But it's probably just beginner's luck. I was just lucky. Let me choose the third item, Bert said. He seemed to suspect that he was being tricked. Maybe Sydney and Leanne and Ted had all cooked this thing up, he wondered, and were trying to pull a joke on him. Turn around, Ted, he ordered, and see if you can guess this one. Bert made his selection, and when the chosen item was safely hidden in Sydney's hand, he allowed Ted to turn back around. Eyes closed tight in concentration, Ted began to focus his inner vision, searching for an image. Almost immediately, he saw something. "Wait a minute, now," he said, "I'm feeling like it's round and small." He made a circle with his fingers and showed them the size. "About like a quarter." "Is it a quarter?" No, it's not a coin, I don't think, because it's sort of rough or jagged around the rim or edge. Like a bottle cap. A Coke bottle cap." The image was crystal clear in Ted's mind. When Sydney opened his fist and the bottle cap gleamed in the light, nobody in the room said a word. Nobody breathed. Ted could hardly move, and when he finally did, he thought he might faint. His stomach lurched and he felt lightheaded. Without a sound, he turned and walked out of the service area, into the employee lavatory, where he promptly threw up. Half an hour later, when he was finally able to return to work, no mention was made of continuing the test with the pencil, the safety pin, and the bottle cap. He didn't tell her about throwing up, however. Maya had very little response, which surprised Ted. He thought that surely she would make a big fuss and say, "I told you so," but instead she just smiled and nodded. "What do you think about that?" he pressed. "Don't you think that's pretty strange?" "I knew it already," she said quietly, taking his hand. Looking into her eyes, Ted thought once again just how very mysterious the beautiful woman was, how much older she seemed, older in some ways than anyone else he'd known. There was an ageless, perpetual calm about her. She always focused on him and their conversations, yet she seemed lovingly detached from everything. They still met frequently throughout the summer, but Ted was aware of a slight change in their relationship. It seemed that after the photo album test, Maya's concentration on him relaxed. It was as if she'd been working hard at a task, and now that it was accomplished, she could ease up a little. Ted and Maya became more physical and less mental with each other. They held hands sometimes, or walked through the beautiful nature trails arm in arm, kissing occasionally, easy in one another's presence. Ted loved her, he realized, but he also knew that it wasn't the sort of passionate love he had felt for Jill. With Maya, Ted could be utterly himself and feel accepted. He loved being with her, and most of all he loved the way she pushed the limits of his knowledge. She opened up his mind to worlds beyond his imaginings and shared his explorations into them as his spiritual sister. Even as they grew more intimate with each other, their conversations always remained exotic, and she discussed at length such things as the body's ability to heal itself. "The body knows exactly when something's wrong with it," she once explained. "When we learn how to ask our body for help, when we can have faith in its abilities, a natural healing occurs." "All I know about natural healing," Ted commented, "is what my grandmother told me. She gathered lots of wild plants out in the woods and used them for tonics and medicines. She could remove warts from people's hands." "Plants can be very useful," Maya agreed, "but the body also works without them. It's just a matter of the right knowledge." Ted thought that with Maya, everything seemed to be a matter of knowledge, and he struggled to comprehend the many topics she discussed. He also found another source of information and ideas in the delightful person of a new employee, Samantha. She was the epitome of a little old lady, complete with numerous cats, and she and Ted soon became good friends. He discovered that Samantha was an astrologer, something else he knew nothing about, and he was eager to learn. Day after day, Samantha discussed astrology with Ted, branching out into other areas of the metaphysical. She taught him about the configurations of the stars. They were sources of energy, she explained, and this energy has a great effect on humans. He began to learn about the human energy field, too, and he wondered if it had anything to do with his strange ability to know things about other people, as Maya had suggested. By the end of the summer, Ted had been exposed to the rudiments of the metaphysical world, thanks to the two women's influence. Walking along the nature trail one afternoon while telling Maya about some of Samantha's ideas, Ted suddenly remembered an unusual article he'd read in the paper recently. "Hey, did you see that news story about a UFO? What do you think about that stuff?" Since Maya frequently discussed outer space, other stars and planets, he thought she would be interested in the article. Maya stopped and sat down by the side of the trail, looking out into the sky. "Don't you think it's very probable that other life exists elsewhere in the universe, not just right here?" she asked in return. "I don't know," Ted replied. "Nobody in Alabama ever talked about seeing them. Guess I never really thought about UFOs before." "Oh. Well, I've seen a UFO," Maya said. "My friend and I just saw one recently, in fact." "You and Lyra?" he asked, and she nodded. "Where?" he demanded, as he jumped up and pulled Maya to her feet. "Come on, I want to see one, too. Show me where y'all saw it." Maya resisted with a laugh. She pointed up the nature trail. "It's easy to find," she said. "Go up that way and around the next bend. Just a little farther on, you'll see a ridge where two mountains come together. It makes a V-shaped notch on the horizon. And that's where you and Lyra saw it?" "Yes, we were walking up there last week, and we saw a UFO hovering right in that gap, just before dark." Ted glanced at his watch. "Maybe we ought to go have a look now," he suggested. "It's getting almost late enough." "No," Maya said, "it's getting so late that I have to go back to work." She started down the trail with Ted following after her reluctantly. "Boy," he said, "I'd sure like to see one. Just so I would know for myself." "Try it, then," Maya replied. "We've seen them a few times. If you'll come back out here late in the afternoon, before dark, you might see it. Lyra and I saw it a couple of times at dusk." "Will you go with me?" Ted asked. "Well, if I can," Maya hesitated. "But my schedule is so busy, and I have to see my friends a lot." "Don't wait for me, go have a look whenever you can." She ran on down the hill and soon disappeared into the maze of paths and buildings in the valley. With or without his mysterious friend, Ted determined to go back up the trail the following afternoon and look for the UFO. He kept to the trail until it reached a small bend, and then he walked on farther, scanning the area. At last on the horizon, Ted could see a deep gap between two mountains, and through that V-shaped opening he could gaze into the desert. Satisfied that he'd found the right place, Ted sat back on a comfortable perch and lit a cigarette. His eyes moved steadily across the vista as he waited, but he had no idea what exactly to expect. A shiny, whistling flying saucer? Little green men from Mars, peering out from portholes and waving their antennae at the Earthlings below? He didn't have to wait long. Something did appear, but it wasn't at all what he expected. Right above the gap he saw a dark spot in the air. It was an object, a body of some sort, but it was disappointingly too far away for Ted to recognize any particular shape. He watched silently as the dark object hovered, listening for any identifying sound, but there was none. Then the object left its stationary position and for several minutes made slow, odd maneuvers, always keeping within the space of the mountain gap. After a while, it turned and leisurely flew away toward the desert. Ted watched until it was no more than a speck against the sky. And then that, too, disappeared. He sat back against his perch, puzzled. Was that a UFO? He asked himself. No, it was just a dot in the sky, he replied. But it didn't make any noise, it didn't fly the way airplanes do, the argument continued. As a UFO sighting, however, the whole thing was a big disappointment. No lights, no little green men, just a dot in the sky that didn't behave as it should. It was intriguing, sure, but not identifiable. Sort of like Maya, he joked to himself. Then his mood suddenly changed, and Ted was overcome by fear. He didn't know why, but he was terrified that the UFO, or whatever it was, might be coming back to get him, and all he could think to do was run away. The sky was dark, darker than it should have been, and he wanted to get out of that place immediately. Without stopping, Ted ran all the way back down the winding trails and into the valley floor at breakneck speed. He didn't stop until he reached the side entrance of the lodge, where he hurried inside and up to the dining area that overlooked the skating rink. Out of breath and still shaky, Ted ordered coffee and sat back to rest. He didn't understand what had made him panic, but the fear had been real. Now, in the lodge, surrounded by people and watching the skaters, everything seemed quite normal. The next time he ran into her, Ted told Maya what he'd seen and how ambiguous it had been. "If that's a UFO," he finished, "there's not much to them, is there?" "Oh, that was a UFO all right," Maya assured him. "If you'd been closer, you could have seen the shape and everything." "How do you know?" Ted asked. "It was just a little, dark spot. Lyra and I saw the same thing you did," Maya said, "and we've seen it a few times up close." "It's a UFO, believe me." "Where did you see them before?" Ted asked. "I mean, up close like that?" "When we were in the mountains," she told him. "Which mountains?" "Those," she pointed vaguely, "north of here." Ted started to ask another question, but Maya changed the subject immediately. "Listen," she said, "I've been wanting to ask you something. Summer is almost over, you know. When are you going to leave the valley and go back to school?" Ted was so surprised by the question that he forgot about the UFO. He and Maya had talked about dozens of things, but not about college plans, or any other plans for his future. "Never, I wish," he said, thinking of how near he would be to Jill if he went back to Tuscaloosa. That whole affair was still too recent for him to want to see her again. His experience with Jill hadn't killed his belief in God, but it had made him wonder how God's angels could have fouled up his emotional life so badly. "I really haven't decided," he continued. "Eventually I guess I'll have to go back to school, but what's the rush? I really love what I'm doing here." "But didn't you tell me you'd been away from home for a couple of years now?" "Yeah," he nodded. Maya held his hand and looked squarely into Ted's eyes. "Don't you think," she said slowly, "don't you think it's time you went home to be with your family again? Don't you want to go back to school and get on with your life?" Before she had spoken, Ted had no intention of returning to Alabama, not for a very long time. But once she took his hand and spoke those words, Ted knew with a surprising certainty that that was exactly what he was going to do. Maya had spoken in a friendly, casual tone, just as always, but the effect of her words had the force of a command. The desire to go home flamed up in him, and when he looked down on the valley below, he saw clearly that his time there was at an end. "My friends and I are leaving, too," Maya said as they walked back down to the lodge area. "I'll be sure to see you again before we go, though, don't worry. Bye for now." Maya disappeared, but the desire for home that she had awakened in Ted remained. There wasn't much time to make all the necessary arrangements, so for the next few days Ted hurried from place to place putting everything in order for his departure. In the midst of all this pressure, however, one afternoon he felt a surprising compulsion to break away and hike up one of the more remote trails beyond the lodge. He sensed that Maya was up there and that she wanted to see him. He went, and she was there waiting beside the trail, smiling expectantly as he approached. "See," she said, "I told you we'd be together one more time, didn't I? And have you taken care of that business we talked about last time? Are you finally going home?" "Yeah," he nodded, "in a couple of days. How about you?" "My friends and I will be leaving next week," she said. "How wonderful that you're going home, Ted. Have you told your parents yet?" Ted didn't answer right away. As he looked at Maya, he realized sadly that he might not see her again for a long time. And he was very reluctant to say goodbye. "I wish I could tell you what your friendship means to me," he said. "If it wasn't for you, the way you've listened to me and my problems, I don't know how I would have gotten over Jill. You've made a big difference in my life." Maya smiled but said nothing. "I really love you," Ted continued. You're my best friend, Maya, and leaving you is the hardest part of all. You have to go, though, she said. My friends and I won't be here, anyway, so we couldn't see each other even if you stayed in Sun Valley. I know, but we don't have to lose touch, he insisted. Give me your phone number so I can call when I get back home, okay? You can't call, I'm afraid, Maya replied. My people don't actually have telephones. What? I know you all live up in the mountains, but just where exactly? He asked. A long, long way up in the mountains, she said evasively. It's really very isolated. Well, don't you go to school somewhere? Ted was becoming very puzzled. How could a group of people live without telephones, so far up in the wilderness, and still have the schools that Maya and her friends attended? Yes, I go to school, she answered, but not exactly like you do. What do you mean? You have teachers, right? Oh, yes, she nodded. Is the school in a town? He asked, wondering if he could phone her there. No, not a town, she shook her head. You wouldn't understand. You're right, I don't understand, Ted said. How do you go to school, for Pete's sake? We have teachers in our group, was all the explanation Maya gave. Ted was completely frustrated by that time, yet he stubbornly determined to keep digging. I've been up in those mountains, Maya, he said angrily, waving his arm toward the northern snowy peaks. All the way across the summit. There aren't any towns up there. There aren't any houses. Most of the time you can't even drive across there because of the snow. And you're trying to make me believe that you live up there? I don't understand why you're doing this, because it can't be true. Yes, it is true. All I can say is that it really isn't me, or my choice, Maya told him. I'm there with my family. They're living up there because we're waiting. For what? Ted asked in bewilderment. For something to happen. Waiting for what to happen? You wouldn't understand if I told you, Maya replied. It's far too complicated, Ted, please believe me. But you will understand one day. Let that be enough for now. Why do I have to wait? He argued. Can't you at least try to explain? I'm not stupid, I can understand a lot of complicated things, you know that by now. Maya was unmoved. You really would not understand, she shook her head. I'd like to explain it, but you can't grasp it right now. You will someday. Taking another tack, Ted persisted, this time with questions about her family. If you don't have telephones, he said. And you don't live in a town, and there aren't any houses up there, just where does your family live? We live in the mountains, Maya answered patiently. In? Ted echoed, trying to understand. In the mountains? You mean, actually inside them? Like in a cave? Yes, she said, as if no further explanation were required. But how do you get your food? I don't understand any of this. We bring it in and keep supplies, she said. Is something bad going to happen, Maya? Ted asked. Is that what you're waiting for? No, she said, no, it's not bad. Well, if you don't have a phone, then, Ted went on, can we at least write to each other? You can't, she replied. We don't have any mail delivery where we live. Frustrated at every turn, Ted pleaded with her. I'm going over 2,000 miles away, Maya, he begged, and you say I can't even write you? I can't call you? You're my best friend, I care about you. I love you. This isn't fair. Don't worry, Maya told him serenely. You'll see me again. I promise. He realized that there was nothing more to say, and nothing he could do to change her mind. Taking what comfort he could in her oath, Ted gave her one last hug and then kissed her, and the two friends parted. Final details kept him busy, but at last everything was arranged and he had his rail pass in hand. His departure from Sun Valley was suddenly less than 4 hours away. More than anything, he wanted to see Maya one last time. Ted was bewildered by her insistence that they couldn't stay in contact, and he thought surely there must be a way, if only he could find her again and persuade her before the bus left. He stored his luggage and raced out of the lodge, but then he stopped, at a loss. Ted had no idea where Maya lived. He went to the other employee dorms around the complex, but nobody recognized her name. Even when he went from door to door and described Maya, he failed to find one person who knew anything. With time rapidly running out, he realized that the personnel office would know how to find Maya. He raced to the office for help. John, the director, had come to know Ted well and told him how sorry he was to be losing such a great employee. "If you ever want to come back and work here," he said, "just let me know." Ted thanked him impatiently and asked John where Maya lived. "Who?" John asked. "The name's not familiar." "You've got to know this girl," Ted insisted. "She's so beautiful you'd have to be blind not to notice her. Believe me, you'd remember." And he described Maya all over again. John shook his head. "Sorry, Ted, you've got me stumped. Don't you have a last name, at least?" "No," Ted admitted, "but I know she was a waitress. I saw her in uniform." "You're bound to have something in the files. We have hundreds of employees without a last name." John explained, "There's no way for me to locate her. If she really works here, which I doubt. I've done all the hiring, Ted. And I just don't remember anyone with that name." Ted's hope was collapsing, but he still had 2 more hours and he wouldn't give up. He went back through all the dorms, through the chalet and the lodge, and finally he ran up to the nature trails, hoping by chance she would be there. But the mountains were empty. Reluctantly, he returned for his luggage and stood in front of the lodge, silently saying goodbye to his paradise. One last time he reached out and scratched through the redwood illusion down to the cement beneath it. Then Ted walked slowly to the bus station, all the while scanning the distance for any glimpse of Maya. The yellow bus of his old dreams arrived, and he had no choice but to get on board. He thought ironically of how very different his emotions had been the first time he rode that bus. Then, it had been the beginning of a dream come true, but the dream had become a nightmare. He had recovered, though, and learned how to feel again. But now the bus had returned, to take him away from everything he had come to love. The machine lurched to life, and as it rumbled down the road, Ted gazed out the window unhappily, until the valley disappeared.